All right, we are live.
Okay, howdy.
Hey, so let's see. Here is what we're doing. Well, I guess to start off with, um, I should answer a question from Chris Smith, who says, "What do you guys think of data-centric rigging?" Thanks. So it's actually kind of an interesting question because the term data-centric rigging could potentially mean more than one thing. And, I'm not quite sure what exactly you mean by that. There's a lot of things it could mean. I mean, on some level, a lot of the stuff that I do with componentized rigging could be considered data-centric rigging. Like, that's a term you could use for it. Whether it actually consists of data-centric rigging or not is, I don't know if that's exactly what you mean. So anyway, if you can clarify that, or you know what, I'm actually just going to Google it right now. Let's see. Yes, actually, this is something that Miguel Campos has been talking about, or I should say Mikael. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong.
I think that's pretty close. Miko.
Yep. Yeah. So what he's talking about basically is, I mean, I'd have to read the article a little bit more just to totally make sure that I, understand exactly what he's going on here. Um, but it's basically about scalability, about sharing either rig assets, like specifically assets that make up a rig, or other aspects of sort of your rigging pipeline. And so to comment on exactly what he means by that, in completely, I'd have to read the article and have more of a sense of exactly what he's talking about. But my assumption, given that we're doing this on a stream and I'm going to make this up, and if I'm wrong, I'll apologize. Is that it is not at all dissimilar in concept, if not necessarily in execution, from something I do want to talk about soon, which is componentized rigging. And that would be a form of data-centric rigging in this case, which is to say you have essentially data that is actually shared between rigs. And the form that I've often used that with rig components has been that they are actual Maya files. That you have uh, you've got like pieces of rigging in various files that get assembled into an actual rig, and that can be assembled in a variety of ways. And I very much doubt that that's the only way that one would look at the concept of data-centric rigging. There's probably a number of ways one could look at that concept, but it's one that I've tended to actually start using a lot, because it gets around the issue of what I think of as being the source of truth problem in rigging, which is, and this is very common with traditional auto riggers, which is you've got a script, or a system. I mean, it's a script in some way, right? That builds you a rig, and then your rig exists as data in a Maya scene, but also kind of in a sense as the script, because the script is what you're theoretically supposed to use to rebuild it if you want to change it. In my experience, that generally doesn't actually work, right? Generally speaking, people need to go change that rig anyway, and then they do. So, not necessarily, like
Right.
you're very rarely have I seen people be able to have a comprehensive and easy enough method of defining that rig outside the context of, whatever method of rig definition you're using in your auto rig system, such that it is easy for people to go make ad hoc rig modifications as is often necessary. And so they usually just do it in the scene, which then destroys your ability to rebuild the rig.
Yeah, this is a problem that comes up with code a lot too.
Yeah.
Like a lot of code generation tools, and I think it's a really similar problem. There have historically been a lot of code generation tools. I remember doing Windows GUI programming. It was famous for this at one point with like MFC, where it would generate thousands of lines of code for you to
Yeah.
begin a project with. But then the problem is you have thousands of lines of code, and if you want to do something different, you have to go edit it. But what if you want to change your mind about the options of how you generated it, for instance, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
kind of stuck and you can't do that. You can't move back and forth between the two phases easily.
Yeah, that is that reminds me very. I mean, that's a very analogous situation, and one of the ideas here that I think is actually really critical, and I think you can see it in Control Rig. Like not everything does things the way that Maya does them. Is instead of a program that makes a rig, your rig is a program. And after all, your rig, in fact, is a program. Like, even if you made it completely by hand with nodes in Maya, that's a program, actually. And so, a program that is your rig is generally a much more sort of stable and editable thing than a program that creates a this completely different representation, in a sense, compiles to a rig. And one of the ways to achieve that is this idea of componentized rigging, where you actually make your rig in the node graph, and you may actually use little bits of scripting to assist with that, but you're not intending to like rebuild that stuff. You're keeping things in these separate files that then get sort of like snapped together, right? They fit together in a certain way with these inputs and outputs, and it lets you have a lot of very nice. There are a lot of very nice consequences to doing things that way. And that's probably a topic largely for another stream, but it is something there. I've just moved very, very far away from thinking that conventional auto rigging, at least, is like a good idea. There are just so many problems that we just deal with consistently between multiple companies. Like, a big part of my career actually has been like going to different places and trying to deal with the consequences of auto rig tools that were often written by people who don't work there anymore. And that in some cases nobody understands. Like,
I mean, there's a real sense in which you could think of a lot of the ways that the ephemeral system works as being very data driven, in the sense that, I mean, you're going to have some nodes in the Maya scene, but they mostly just have IDs tacked onto them.
Right.
And then what you have is some data that's actually literally stored in JSON format. That is what drives all of the behavior of the actual rig. And so you can add features and you can add a feature to the ephemeral system, and an existing ephemeral rig will just pick it up automatically, because what's changing is sort of the framework that the data is being driven through.
Right. So one way to sort of put that in different terms is and this is often a very good thing to do in a programming context, right? In the ephemeral system, there's a separate definition of what the rig should do and how the rig does it. So you have this metadata that just says, here's the different parts of the rig and how they can relate to each other. And it does not say anything about what that means. Like, it doesn't make any explicit connections between anything. It doesn't say, like this is a parent constraint, or this is a direct connection, or any of these other. It doesn't tell you what to do. It only says this is the nodes that exist and the different ways that they can potentially relate to each other. And then the system interprets that and does all of the actual calculation at runtime. And you can think of it in some ways as being kind of rule-based. Like, you're basically creating this bunch of rules that's like, well, under this circumstance, do this. Under this circumstance, do that. But it's this very high-level thing of, like, you're not telling it how to do that, just what it should do. And those kinds of divisions between things. Yeah.
It is data-driven.
Right.
And a lot of the time you write, in software, you do that a lot, where you'll write a framework that hides all of the procedural stuff for you, all the stuff that's like, this is the mechanics of how you do stuff. And then when you actually want to, and it's very general, and when you want to do specific things, what you're doing is just creating some data that you feed into the framework. And there are pros and cons to that. I mean, it's hard to do things that the framework isn't designed to do in that kind of a system. But it does mean that everything's very declarative, very static, and assuming that the framework is correct, it's pretty easy to get this stuff right. You're just sort of creating data.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's vastly easier to do things in that way, which is one of the aspects of conventional rigging that I want to do away with. Like, this sense that, like, you look at, like, a naively written, and many auto rig tools are written much better than this, but a naively written auto rig tool just looks like a big old list of nodes and connections, and is impossible to make sense of in a high-level way, and that's disastrous, right? And what the componentized rig approach does is to sort of, it's not really data-driven in quite the same way, because you're still making pieces of Maya behavior, right, in Maya with nodes and connections and stuff, and that's kind of procedural, sort of conceptually. But it is the way that those things behave and how they relate to each other is an established thing, I guess one could say, right? It's like a Well, I mean, like I said, this is really for a different stream, and what we're actually here to do is to finish the rabbit animation.
Okay,
I'll just
yes.
say, like, each component has an interface, and anyone who has done much programming maybe kind of gets what that means, and for everybody else, I'll have to explain it for another stream. So let's actually start talking about actually the latest version of the Ephemeral system, because I am once again taking my life in my hands by showing you a version that hopefully is going to be totally fine and not have any issues. And may or may not actually be totally fine and not have any issues. However, I've done something in this case very different with the color coding. Before, we saw color coding based on constraints. This is actually kind of related to what we were just talking about. And it was pretty clear that this was the wrong thing to do, actually. Because if you're doing color coding based on constraints, well, constraints aren't what you actually define about the ephemeral system. They're not actually what's important. What's important is actually behaviors. And the constraints are just sort of part of how the system figures out what to do based on these behaviors. So in this case, for instance, I'm currently in default mode, and I have selected the upper body. Well, I've selected the upper body. I've selected the shoulders, torso, whatever. And depending on what mode I'm in, you're going to get a pretty clearly different idea of what's going on here. So if I am in default mode, you can see that the elbow and the mid-spine are being driven in a... they're pink, so that's a suspension / pseudo IK sort of scenario. The like shoulders, well, actually not the shoulders, like the shoulders, I guess, are light blue because I am currently using I have rotation isolation on. If I were to turn it off, sorry, I just turned off blue instead, then you would see that they become darker blue because they are in fact rotation isolated, and they are they are not big and thick because these things are in default mode. And so there's kind of a way that I'm trying to get the user to have a sense of, okay, so if I, for instance, I can decide what it means for a man, I'm explaining this badly. There's a concept in the ephemeral system of a limb. There's a concept that you have, for instance, forward. So here's forward all. I want to make it really clear to the user that there's a difference between those things. Forward affects this area in a direct forward way, but everything else is kind of doing its default thing in response. Forward all affects everything. I'm actually going to turn off glue groups for a second. That was yellow because it's glued. And that is overriding the default behavior with a very specific behavior beyond this point. And it would be the same way if I'm doing backward or backward all. So now in backward all, these legs are forward because that's sort of how the graph would trace through this backward area, and you can sort of swing back from here. Now, one of the things I'm sort of still figuring out is, should these also be red? Because they are backwards of this control. And I think that they should not be, because their actual behavior here is forward. Because if you think about what's going on here, it's tracing the graph, it's starting with the middle of the body, it's tracing backwards this way, but then it hits this area, and it continues tracing forward in order to reach the leg. It would, I think, be wrong to have these be red, because that would imply that it was tracing back up the leg. This might be a little different once we get any sort of arrow or something, which is something I think I might like, in order to indicate the direction of control. And that's something that I think would be really ideal, actually, but is, not something we have right now. But anyway, I'm just going to keep working on this, and hopefully it will not blow up in my face. I guess we will find out. But this should at least make some of the things that I'm doing, and what they mean, a little more clear. Like here's forward all, and that should make it clear that I'm affecting this whole upper body. Also, there is like a weird speed hitch in this version that I need to investigate, possibly related to this coloring stuff, where things take a little longer when you do undo or anything else that causes it to reevaluate the colors. I don't know if that's actually the colors doing it, but that's a continual thing. That's just some optimization that needs to be done, I think, on the new features. There mostly should actually be significantly faster in terms of the actual performance of the rig, but when you do certain actions, there's stuff I still need to work on, I guess. All right. Anyway, let's get into this. I'm going to start by just watching through it and taking a look at where I want to start adding in-betweens. Alright, so actually the first thing I'm going to do is just trim this a bit. I'm actually not going to animate him coming in because I don't really feel like I need for the test to be a good test, you know? Alright, I'm going to end it at 190. Let's look through this again. Actually, before I start in-betweening it, here's actually the next thing to do. It's to do a little more with his eyes and face. Because I feel, now that I've started to in-between this a little bit more, and I've gotten more of a sense of like how it's going to play, I see that his face is looking a little dead. And let me address that before I do more in-betweening. So he's looking here. Let me actually just adjust his eye line a little bit. There we go. Let's see. And I am going to put a blink right here. Here's a blink. I am going to store this pose. Now this is an area where you can see that this actually really ought to be a pose library. And there's no reason why it theoretically couldn't be a pose library, we just haven't implemented that yet, you know? So now you have to store them one by one. That's like, the code's all there to make it any pose, right? It's just, we have to, do an interface for it and stuff to make it a pose library. Well, and like save the poses somewhere, and that helps. I think I am going to add one in between here, where I'm going to have like a tiny little eye dart or something, just like help with this keep alive. So that means I'm going to start actually filling out a little bit of the in-betweens here. Let's see, I'm going to do this in default mode. Oh, that was actually a bug where it had everything be white there when you were doing the breakdown. I thought I had the most recent version, but apparently I didn't actually have the most recent version. Alright, because I just wanted a little tiny bit of keep alive there. I actually am going to bias that just a little further. But, of course, I want to keep the foot back where it was. Alright. Oh, right. I need to do that to the whole thing. Or it's not going to do anything particularly useful. Yeah. Let's just see. Yeah, just drop those very, very slightly, because that makes a slightly better arc, even though it's a tiny little arc, but it still matters. And actually, I'm gonna like explicitly do that here, and make sure that the arc actually works. Alright, so I'm going to say shift his attention slightly right there. And I want to bias the... So I want the eyes to move pretty fast. They're just going to be like a little more of a flick. All right, so now his foot's lifting off. I want to change how that works. You know, just noting here that I'm in backwards mode, you can see exactly what things it's going to affect. Using Pickwalker there to walk things. Shifted to default mode. It is really nice to see the color coding, because it, like, then you actually know what your rig's gonna do instead of guessing, which was always kind of an issue here. All right, I'm gonna just like, yeah, every time I switch modes, there's that slight hitch now, and I do need to do a little bit of figuring out what I did that's causing such performance issues. It's not really the end of the world, but it's definitely not what's supposed to be happening, and it's not what was happening. Just making sure the arc on his pelvis still looks good. Because, like, you know, yeah, we want to avoid any wall hits there. Alright, let's take a look. Yeah, it's not that bad. One of the nice things about working on, like, 2s and 3s and stuff is you can kind of get away with some stuff that, you know, you probably have to polish a lot more if you were doing sort of like full, you know, on ones animation. And it's kind of like it works anyway. Like, it's not the audience's focus. I do think I'm going to add an additional one there, though. Here's a particularly nice thing that you can do. That thing where you just like grab it by the elbow and just shift it out to where you want it to be in terms of like his shape. Because like otherwise, if it's just like if it's a linear thing, if it's just sort of like directly into the pose, then it looks really CG. This is again like leading with the elbow, having the elbow just go slightly first, and it's so much easier to do. I'm actually going to turn that slightly to move more with the arc. There we go. And between here and here, I think I would also like a 1. Although, actually, before I do that, maybe... Yeah, let me get rid of that. I should check and make sure that his head and such are doing a useful thing here. Yeah, his head actually should trail slightly here, I think. So again, switch into free mode so that the head is, you know, not being affected by anything else, which if we had little arrows here, that would be a little more clear. That is something I really would like to add. And I bias it back. Whoops. Nope, because I shouldn't turn off blends use all minutes. There we go. And actually, I'm going to kind of do like that a little bit. There's almost like a little counter movement in his head. Yeah, there we go. Here again, looking at the onion skins, you can see exactly where to line his ears up, which otherwise is just a huge pain to do. Oh yeah, actually, I really should have thought a little bit more about these ears. There we go. Alright, so let's see. We have... I kind of wanted to add another 1 in the middle here, and I think I will. Because that's quite a large difference in motion there. Although, sometimes you can kind of get away with not doing that. Like, some animation styles really work fine. But I think the style we have here, though, on 2s and 3s that we've been doing here is, like, smooth-ish. Right? So it doesn't quite fit this style to have such a big jump. So what would fit the style there? think something like this. Yeah, and then this also. Oh, you're kidding me. Okay, well, I don't remember the last time I saved. No idea what happened there. I'm going to go work on a different part of the shot and then come back to that. Because whenever that happens, it's just, it's like frustrating and doesn't, I don't want to go right back to the thing I was working on and try to replicate exactly what I was doing. Alright, let's like, I don't know why the Hypershade is open. Oh, it's because I opened 2018, which isn't even what I'm using here. Yes, Maya, I would actually like you to close. Thank you. This is how you know you're watching a live stream. You don't generally see this in recorded demos. Alright, here we go. How much of this did I save? Possibly nothing, like a complete idiot. I mean, it's not really a big deal. Like, that was not a huge amount of work, but it is very frustrating whenever that happens. Oh no, I didn't totally lose it. Like, take a look here. Some of that stuff that I did is actually still present. Alright, so not the end of the world. Just obnoxious. Yeah, that should work. Let's do our onion skinning. Alright. Alright, so let's take a look at this again. Yep, there's our little eye dart. Like, yeah, most of what we did is still there. That's not the end of the world. Ooh. Before I do anything else, let me turn off... Actually, it worked out okay, but turn off glue active, because of course his hands aren't supposed to be affecting the cube anymore. The reason why that worked, actually, is actually kind of interesting, and maybe a useful insight into what the ephemeral system does. It's comparing these two frames when it's making its breakdown. And the cube's position doesn't change between those two frames. So even though it's glued to the hand in this scenario, it doesn't actually matter. I mean, you'd see it moving around while the slider is happening. No, you would, though. Right, here's what must have actually happened there. It started tracing the graph from the cube. Like I've said, one of the things I'd really like to do is offer a little bit better control over which thing takes precedence when you have multiple things that could, that could take precedence in the graph. Alright, so, breakdown. Yep, that's all correct. But you don't want to count on that, at least not till I, actually implement a feature where you totally can count on it, which I have every intention of doing. Alright. Actually, I'm going to swing this back a little bit more. I mean, I know this one's like a huge jump, but it actually doesn't bother me, and I almost kind of like it. In fact, I might even swing this one a little bit further. This, on the other hand, this one really needs an in-between. And actually, it's a funny way to think about it, because it's not that it needs an in-between, because it is... it is too far to move to have it be on twos. It needs an in between because I want to make the motion between here and here a little clearer. Because specifically, if you think about the arc of this movement, you'd expect it to kind of come up and around a little bit. And even though this is going to happen very quickly, it's something that I think is going to be important to the read of the motion. Right, because otherwise you don't really get that. You don't really like see it grab on as much. Yeah, you don't get the like thing where he grabs if you don't have another frame in there. Honestly, when you're doing stuff on ones and twos, sometimes the amount that the thing it's less important to think about how far things move in screen space, so that can be important too, than to think about what information does your audience's eyes need to fill in the details. Because a big part of working on ones and twos and threes and fours sometimes is to remove detail in much the same way that if you're a painter and you'll paint stuff in a you'll mass things together and you'll block out areas of color and you'll only add details where it's actually important, and the audience's eye will go fill in the feeling that this is a real place even though you've just eliminated detail from lots of places, or just never put it in the first place. And working on ones and twos and threes and fours has a similar effect for animation, where you're basically free to ignore detail where it doesn't matter, and where the audience's eye can do the work of filling in that detail. It makes your life a lot easier, actually, assuming you're working with a style that's compatible with this idea. All right. Anyway, I'm gonna in between this. I'm gonna put two in betweens in the middle. I don't know if it was necessarily evident, but that was much faster than the previous in-betweening stuff. Some things got slower and some things got faster. If we want him all the way back there, we got to do a little more to get him there, I think. Here's where some smooth will help. Let's put it more or less in the middle. Now look at that back foot. Don't quite like what it's doing. See how it's like sliding over a... Like, I did those in-betweens, but I wasn't really thinking about that foot when I did them. I was thinking about the head. And, like, so here's what's going on now. And they just slide back in sort of an unfortunate way. We don't really want them to do that. In fact, I am seriously thinking that this ought to hit over here, like, a little bit more. And then this foot shouldn't have moved before then. So, here's a case where it's pretty easy to fix. I can store a pose, and I can say for the duration of this here, only for my selected item, actually I'm going to do the whole foot, I'm going to apply store pose over time. Oh, and by saving, I removed my time range, so. There we go. Now I've got everything else, but the foot doesn't move. Yeah, something there looks weird. Oh, I see. It's the timing change from having moved it back here. So I actually need to scoot this stuff up a little bit more. So that's fine. I just need to take his body and bias it. In default, I'll need to bias it back a little bit. Something a little like this, maybe. Yeah. Nah, I need to bias it a little bit more in this direction in order to make it work. Back this way. That's starting to work a little better, I think. Alright, so... the reason why I'm pushing these forward a little bit here is I want them to overshoot a little bit now that the head has sort of come more or less to rest. These things have to, essentially follow the same arc they were on. They don't know about the fact that the head... They don't fully know that the head has stopped yet. The tips haven't gotten the message. Oh, look at that. I didn't do the hand grip there properly after I extended this out. All right, let's do this. Let's grab a pose. Let's apply it only to... yeah, we should be applying it only to the fingers. Actually, really all the fingers. Because by this point, it should already be there. Let's make sure it's... yeah, no, actually, at this point. These two, I think. There we go. Feeling a little floaty to me now. I might tighten up the timing just a little tiny bit. Yeah, I might actually convert these two to one. So let's see if we do that. If that's the right thing. And add a little bit more of that anticipation time. Yeah, that's better. And now I'm actually going to delete a couple of those because now I feel like it's too smooth. Yeah, I'm going to delete this one. We don't actually need that, I don't think. Okay. Gonna actually make these be on 3s a little bit, which I think will probably be fine for that. They don't move very much. Yeah, that's fine. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm going to do it like that. I'm actually going to, in between that, similarly subdivide by 2. That's going to put 2 keys, 2 poses. Shouldn't call them keys. They're not really keys in the middle here. Now, we see that head looking a little weird there as it hits its hits the pose pretty hard, and then doesn't really change that much as it goes back, right? So we need to smooth that out, and the first way I'm going to do that is to actually have it go a little bit further, and then smooth it out. So I think I'm going to start re-breaking that down as my way of smoothing that out to begin with, and then maybe use some actual smooth. Yeah, I'm going to do that here. And then, because there's still like that little bobble there, here's a great place to switch to free mode. Switch to free mode, now it's free. And smooth over time. Actually, though, before I do that, kind of want him to be a little more like that. I'm going to stop worrying about pass-throughs. I just don't care right now. Keeping in mind that because I am doing things, I'm in free mode, smooth over time is happening in... wait, what the... huh? Alright. I did something clearly very messed up here. What the heck just happened? Apparently, I broke something. I'm just going to do this manually. This is how I used to do it before, doing smooth over time, and it kind of sucks. But apparently I broke smooth over time. Alright, so, on the other hand, we do know that store pose over time works fine, which we're about to use, because here's the issue here, now it's too smooth. Yeah, see, it's like that head is just sort of slowly moving down. I don't really want to do that. I want it to hit its final pose. In this case, I'm going to grab both the head and the neck, and I'm going to use this in default mode, because otherwise, if I did it in free mode, I'd be dealing with its position in world space. Although, that might actually not be the worst thing, but I really want it to be relative to the body in this case, I think. So, what I'm doing is I want to bias this whole area more towards this pose. So here's what I can do. I can store the pose, and, I'm not using use all nodes, so it's only affecting selected poses. Well, selected controls and, these selected poses. And I'm going to apply store pose over time, 0.5%. So what that's done is taken these two poses. Oh no. What the heck just happened? Alright, apparently I am actually going to switch back to the old version now, because apparently, even though many things work better in the new version, I must have broken some kind of important stuff in the process of doing many adjustments and refactorings. And apparently the test didn't catch it, which is unfortunate, and probably means we need to write better tests. But anyway. Here I'm going to do my exceedingly, well thought out method of switching between different builds. This is how all the professionals do it. And this should be, well, of course it saved the color changes I made there, but this should be the old version. Yeah, you can see that it is, because it's not changing the colors. So now everything should actually work properly. Alright, where were we? Yeah, I was polishing that head motion a little bit. Alright, let's see this actually work properly. I certainly hope. As I was saying, like, I wanna get these to store pose. And then I want, well, that works a lot better. That was what it was supposed to do. And it basically just biases it back towards where this head is going to be, and I'm actually going to go even a little further with that. I'm actually just going to do it again to push it even closer. Might just in between. Yeah, that's a little better. let's just take another look at this. All right. Still don't like this as much. I'm going to push his head down more. Store the pose. And then... Yeah, you know, here's what I'm actually going to do. I'm going to do a graduated set of them. So, in this case, I'm going to push it almost all the way up. This is something that, you know, I would love to do these things with actual fall-off in the future. So that you can do this in an automated way. So what would be nice is to be able to select a region and a particular fall-off over that region. So that instead of either all or nothing, or instead of either I affect these three poses the same way, or I have to do it manually for each pose, what I'd like to have is the ability to specify a fall-off. It's a bit of a UI issue in some ways. And I am continuing to adjust these poses a little bit to fit better with what I was previously doing. You know, even though that was sort of the in-betweening step, I now see that this makes it his motion a little clearer if I do it like this. It's already pushing back a little bit more at this point. Okay, one more bit of refinement to that section. Alright. I still think that head's too smooth. I know I've been working, like, you get stuff like that, right? Where you're like, oh, everything else goes nicely and smoothly, and then there's just one bit that you just like, yeah, it's still not right. That happens all the time. I am going to do it this way and then smooth over this region. I'm actually going to do it full and then smooth. That might actually work better. Alright. Yeah, now it really pops into place. And then I get to sort of smooth over this region to fix that. That's significantly better. It's a subtle thing, but I really... You know... No, it's still too smooth. Oh, right. We're going to do one iteration. That's, I think, a little better. It was just bugging me how slow that head movement was. And now, like, it happens just a little more quickly. And now, I want to do the same to the ears, because I feel like the ears are also too floaty in this case. Actually, what they need to do is a little bit of overshoot. Well, I think that could be improved, but I'm going to leave it aside for now, because I want to see it in the context of like the rest of the in-betweening I'm going to do here before I decide if that region needs more work. I think it probably does, but... Alright, so... I'm actually going to adjust this slightly. Oh, whoops. Did not turn off glue active. There we go. And then I'm going to insert something in here. Now, here's one thing that I think is worth noting about just this whole approach to things, right? Which is something a lot of animators already do. Like, it's not unique to the ephemeral system. The ephemeral system just facilitates it really well. Which is that a lot of, you know, there's definitely been some areas where I'm, like, going, I'm you know, going over this multiple times and, like, you know, dealing with little issues and smoothing it out or whatever. But the nice bit about this is that actually a lot of it kind of does just work. And a lot of that comes down to the combination of having a lot of your secondary sort of implicit in the poses and having, in which case that just sort of works. You know, it just sort of, the right stuff comes out of those poses. And having, and not having like splines that can like overshoot and mess around with you and, you know, make things complicated. And it is the combination of those two things that partly makes this go quickly. I mean, yeah, I kind of screwed around with the head a bunch for like 10 minutes or whatever, but, you know, compared to, like, I'm going through and just sort of like finishing this up and doing a lot of polish, and compared to what you would typically do for a shot like this is a lot faster, actually. It's really nothing. All right, so I'm gonna in between these a bit more. Oh, right, haha, I forgot to turn glue active back on. Although in this case, it kind of still did the wrong thing. This is exactly the scenario where I want these quote-unquote selfish nodes. There are many things that I want to improve. Oh, I see. He was already lifting his hand off. That's why that happened. Still would have helped to have the selfish nodes. Now, was this in-between actually necessary? It's actually a good question. I have a tendency to do things on either 1s or 2s. Sometimes 3s and 4s can actually look really good, though. Like, arguably, I might not need to actually pose it out this closely, and depending on the final style and look of the piece, it might have been preferable to leave those alone. It's sort of hard to say. Like, it really is a stylistic question. One of the things that I actually really like is when people can't actually tell that something's on 2s because the arcs work. And I have had situations in which I've done blocking that was eventually intended to be splined, and people thought it was actually complete. Because here's the thing, like, if you were to watch, I mean, like, ignoring the end of it, right? You know, so it's like, yeah, you know, that stuff needs some more in-betweens. If you were to watch this section here, right? You know, if you really look at it, and if this was, like, really fully rendered, it would be pretty evident that this isn't actually on 1s. But if you're just looking at it as a play blast, you might not really notice, because even though he's on 2s, the arcs and the pose flow sells the idea of smooth motion. StephDev says, finally, the chat is quiet so you can get the animation done. Yeah, that's true. We actually don't have that many people on today. Which, you know, is totally fine. It goes up and down all the time. And this one is going to be a little quiet. I mean, mostly what I am doing here is just getting animation done. Here's a thing. Note that little bobble there. So again, selfish nodes, that has to do with the fact that when interpolating those poses and using glue groups, it wasn't necessarily clear which one of them was leading. And in this case, it would have been the right thing for the cube to lead. But,
Nodes, it's not in yet, and it would solve this problem.
Indeed, that's exactly what it would be. Not that this is really a huge problem, because all I actually really need you to fix it is select this, turn off blends use all nodes, turn glue active back on, because you want the hands to be stuck, to it, and just re-break down this section. So it's not the end of the world to not have it be this way, but I would prefer that, there was a way to just be like, no, I want nodes to be selfish. Or I want them to be selfless, which would mean they are always, whatever you have selected is led by what drives it, instead of being the first thing to drive what it's connected to. That's going to be an easier concept to show than explain. But indeed, now I can be like, I can get rid of that issue. It was quite easy to do, and the hands still stay stuck exactly as they ought to. This is exactly the kind of thing where it's like, well, maybe if you chose what was constrained to what when you were doing your interpolated conventional animation, you wouldn't encounter that issue if you chose that well. But if you did encounter it, it would be incredibly painful to fix. Here, it's a very easy mistake to make, but it's also very, very easy to just fix it. Which is, it's much easier to deal with than having to have made the right choice and then regretting it if you didn't, Alright, so this is going pretty good here, I think. I'm actually going to tighten up the timing here a little bit, because I feel like, it's a little floaty. I'm going to see if I make these all ones, if that actually looks better, and it may. Actually, I think it very much does. All right. I might even see what this looks like. If I leave even like a slightly larger gap here and like push the contact with slowness even more. I kind of have an idea of something different I might do with this region. But I think I'm actually not going to do it, because I don't want this to keep taking forever. There are different directions you can go with animation. There's always like ways to improve it and different ideas, and it wouldn't actually be a huge deal to put something new in at this point, but because it's already 5 o'clock, I think I'm not going to do it. Basically, the idea that I kind of had was, oh, what if during this section he like wheeled his foot around a little bit? He's like, oh, I'm losing balance, and like I'm wheeling the foot around. And that's, I think, an idea that if this were a real shot I was doing, I would, for commercial purposes, I would probably pursue. But I kind of want to get onto something else in the next part of the stream, and I don't think this is terrible. I just think there's a way that it could be improved. And so, I'm gonna, I think, leave it in place right now, because this is primarily for demonstration purposes. Now I am, however, I'm gonna probably stick some blinks in there. But I'll in between that first. Let's see. I might also, switching back to my free mode, bias the whole head a little bit more back from where it previously was. This is the sort of thing that, when this feature is implemented, I might do with a time slip. But for here, I'm just going to use multiple uses of bias. Let's see. Yeah, I just want to make sure I've got the right settings here. I think that should be fine. I just want his head not to move quite as fast as the rest of his body. Yeah, I feel like that improves the feel a little bit. All right, one more thing. I'm not going to do that wheeling around thing, but I am going to lift his foot up a little more. Whoops, wrong mode. There we go. Actually, what I'm going to do in that case is smooth this whole thing out. And I'm going to do that in default mode. Ah, I did not actually do what I thought I did there. Alright, I'm going to bias this then. I was smoothing with something that was not actually moved the whole way. Now I can smooth this bit, and it should work. There we go. I'm going to lift it up slightly so it makes a slightly better arc. You know, I actually think that's now too much, right? Because now it almost feels like his foot's tracking with the cube, and that looks kind of weird. So I'm going to reduce that a bit. And here, like, I could do this with, like, using a stored pose in forward mode and sort of, like, blending it in there a bit. But I feel like in this case, I just want to do it by eye, basically, and just use some re-in-betweening. Or just use smooth. Yeah, because it's fine, I think, for it to be that high by the time it gets there. But I don't want it to be there, and I can just use re-in-between to fix it back to something that works. Now that's the one that needs to be re-in-betweened now. That's better. I actually wanted to get over to that position a little bit sooner, which again, if I had time slip, I would use time slip, but I do not have time slip because it's not a feature we wrote yet. So Filippo Macci says, you don't check the graph editor very much, do you? Well, in fact, this being ephemeral, the graph editor has no use at all, right? Like the graph editor wouldn't even mean anything in this context. Like because everything's in world space actually, and if I switched to, well, it's not really in world space, it's in character space, but you know, if I switched to the graph editor, it would not tell me anything useful. And in fact, I generally regard, especially for this kind of animation, but I think in the long run, for all animation, graph editors, as we know them, you know, like, you know, with spline tool, editing tools in a specific consistent space instead of any space you want, as being actually a bad idea, and I hate them, right? Graph editors are terrible for character animation. They're actually great for some purposes. And I can imagine an ephemeral graph editor, which would let you choose to check that graph in any space, but you know, such a thing does not exist. So, you know, yeah, no graph editor. That's a big important part of this workflow, is that there is no graph editor. And that does mean that a few things that you're doing end up being slightly more difficult, but what you're gaining for that is incredible ease in fixing issues. So for instance, you could say, oh, I had this, like, you know, this thing here. So this leg, I could say, well, I could have pushed it over here with something graph editor related, and then maybe I wouldn't have had to go fix these poses. So you could say that, but now take a look at the consequences. So see this, like, weird little, like, that leg is kind of doing something a little weird there, like it doesn't quite line up. So with something that was very graph editor centric, your choices of what to do in that scenario would be like, yeah, you have to go into the graph editor and figure out what's causing that, and it's a huge pain. I don't have to do that. I can basically take this whole region and just say, I'm going to smooth it a little bit. And chances are that will have gotten rid of that little bobble. And it pretty much did. You just like it, the graph editor has nothing on that, right? You know, it didn't really even change the character of the motion really in a way that was like a significant issue for the performance. And you just can just get into an endless rabbit hole of like tweaking around with splines with a graph editor. Not that you never go into a rabbit hole, like look what I was doing with that head where I was like, like that happens, but it happens so much less than it does with a graph editor. And when it does, it's usually because you don't quite know what you want, not because you can't quite get to what you want, if you see what I mean. Gonna adjust that to improve the arc slightly, and I'm gonna shift this forward because I think a 3 over here is probably the best place for it. Filippo Macci says, oh, I see, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, like, I cannot tell you how much I hate graph editors. Graph editors are a thing of evil, and were a mistake, and it's an understandable mistake, because when people were first devising, like, how should CG animation even function, right? It wasn't a known thing. Nobody necessarily knew how it was supposed to work. And, at first it didn't. And the idea of keyframes with spline interpolation, like, was a perfectly reasonable thing for people to consider back when people were first considering it, which literally was, started in the 1970s. And then it got really, really cemented in the 80s, especially with things like, Luxo Jr., where, there was a famous SIGGRAPH paper where John Lasseter was like, well, here's how I animated this thing using a spline-centric sort of workflow. And as I've always said, and I've said it before in this, on stream, but it bears repeating, you're looking here at a situation where a Luxo lamp is the best possible scenario for that kind of animation, right? It's a very simple hierarchy with a clear bottom to the hierarchy. Like, you're a lot less likely to want to rotate the Luxo lamp from the head. I mean, I think maybe you would, right, actually, but it's much less of an issue than it is with a full character. The problem is that we don't animate Luxo lamps or bouncing balls, right? We animate characters who have limbs and fingers and, need to be doing much more complicated stuff and don't necessarily stand on, like, the one base, but might stand on any bit of their feet or hands, or fall on the ground, or stand on their heads, or be in zero gravity, or I do cartwheels. Who knows, right? Characters can do anything.
I mean, I think in some ways too, the causality goes the other way, in that you had people who are computer scientists going, hey, what are computers good at? Let's write animation software that does what computers are good at. Yep. Computers are good at splining things. And then at first, people animated things that fit well with what computers were good at, right? So it's not so much that Luxo caused splining, it's that splining caused Luxo, right?
Yeah, that is a very good way of putting it. But then once that happened, and people were like, well, I guess this is how CG animation works. And to be clear, it wasn't just Luxo. Like, there's a number of pieces, like Tony DePeltry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Like, there were other examples of things too. It wasn't just Luxo Jr. But that was sort of the approach, and then stuff got built on top of it. So then they went and made Toy Story, and were like, well, this is really hard, maybe we need some IK tools. And they did, but it was sort of built on top of the rigid hierarchical structure. It was like, this is what we have. Let's try to build something on top of it to make it a little less painful. And
I imagine
been like that, yeah.
I imagine that some of it probably came out of, I'm guessing that a fair number of the first people to work on these software systems either were coming out of robotics background or were looking very closely at what people had been doing in robotics.
Yep.
And in robotics, of course, I mean, robotics is, the real world is FK. It's all FK, right?
Right. Well, or another way you could put it, of course, is the real world doesn't have a K, right?
Right.
It's
it doesn't have a K.
Because if I pull on my hand, like if a person pulled on my hand, they could pull my body with it, right?
I guess that's true. But when you are moving, right, you move from your joints.
Right.
Right. And the thing is, when you're designing a robot, the same thing happens, right? Which is why you have to do the calculations for IK to figure out what those FK rotations ought to be.
Indeed.
Basically, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the entire concept of IK actually comes from robotics. I'm pretty sure that that's the case.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. And it's the same thing with these. It is a strict hierarchy of things. I mean, my shoulder and my elbow and my wrist really are a hierarchy. But if you're looking at it from an artist's point of view, it's very different, right? So I think that the nature of the software drove a lot of it. And the truth is that computer animation was so novel at first that it didn't have to be good, at least in the way that like 2D animation has been good
Right.
to be successful in the beginning, right? Like people were
Oh
just
yeah.
like, oh, this is really, really cool. But then the problem is eventually you want to start coming up to those same artistic standards. And the tools I think can fight you there somewhat.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's interesting. Like you look at Toy Story, like the original, and conceptually the animation is good. Like their ideas about how the characters were going to express themselves are good, right? But there's so much weird, stiff animation in Toy Story that just comes from it being really, really hard to animate that way. Um, I mean, if that weren't the case, they wouldn't have changed it. Which, of course, you look at the way modern Pixar animates, and of course, it's still, I mean, it's still basically hierarchical, like all most modern rigging. But it's like, obviously they're not trying to do like pure FK anymore, right? They have all kinds of other stuff that they're doing, that are not dissimilar to like most modern rigging approaches. And if the idea of like having a sort of like a pure FK hierarchy had been the right approach, we wouldn't have built 10,000 things on top of it, right? Anyway, here's another perfect case. That movement of the pelvis was like had like kind of a weird hitch, and I just got rid of the weird hitch by pressing a button. And I still think there's a little bit about that acceleration that I don't quite like, because it's like accelerating. Is it accelerating too fast? Maybe. Let's just see what that looks like if I were to take this region and also smooth it a little bit. And again, I'm just affecting the pelvis at this point. That's nicer. I mean, it's kind of a remarkable thing to note that like a lot of people hearing the concept of ephemeral rigging are like, oh, I mean, but it must be almost impossible to do polish. No, no, no. It's much easier to do polish. That's getting there. Like, what I'm doing here is the equivalent of splining. And of course I did a section that was splined, quote unquote, beforehand too. But like that's normally like a difficult process. And it's really not here. And if I were doing this on ones, I mean, it would be, it would be more work than this is, but it wouldn't be a crazy thing to do. Let's see. I kind of like that bit there being on twos, so I'm gonna leave it. Might want to stick another one in here because that's such a big character, like transformation of where the cube is. I think I do. This bit of like sprinkling in ones where they're important is also something that I think, because your distribution of ones and twos and threes and whatever affects the audience's perception of the motion. It's not just like a thing that you can just sort of be like, oh, I don't really, it matters a lot actually, and making those choices is something that I think really, it's part of why doing things on ones and twos can work. Like you see a lot of animation. I see this all the time, and it bugs me so much. Especially in sort of lower budget productions where people are like, oh, we kind of want something that's kind of toony, but we're not going to like really polish the animation very much. And what you'll see people do is they'll do fairly conventional, like sometimes even like TV quality, right? Like conventional splined animation, and then just like drop every other frame out of it, and it looks horrific. Like that is not, you can animate really, really fast this way. Like what I'm doing here is putting in more work than you necessarily need to if you were going to do like a Saturday morning cartoon version of this approach, right? I'm putting in more work here than would be necessary in that case. But the point being, like, you could put in very little work and get the poses to be nice, just like a drawn animator does, and get the arcs in when you actually do have movement. And it could look good. Trying to use interpolation and drop every other frame out of it, like, it can work if you're willing to put in a very large amount of work on top of making fully like in between animation, like fully splined animation, which makes it more work than it would be otherwise, which is absolutely not the direction you want this to go, right? It's really pretty important, this idea that, here, let's see. So at this point, I'm going to take that foot and have it already have hit the ground. No, the other foot. Thank you. Here, let's see. Maybe bring this one out a little bit. Let's see if that works. Because, oh, no, that's actually not really necessary. No, actually, I think I do like that a little bit. I'm going to just push this back a little bit to match. And then, smooth it. Let's see. Alright, so there we have our additional in-between that I feel like we needed. Don't know if we really need one over there, actually. Like, it's kind of a weird question, like, when do you need them and when don't you, I mean, obviously you need more in here, but let's just see how this is looking. Oh, 1 second. I've just got to answer somebody real quick. Sometimes that happens. And it could be like a slightly urgent thing, potentially. Okay. I will see if that is actually an urgent thing. Turns out not. Oops. Forgot to turn off glue active. There we go. Making sure that there's sort of a nicer arc there. So, StephDev says, have you guys happened to have seen the retopology app called Cozy Blanket? I've heard of it. I haven't really been paying a lot of attention to it in particular. I bring it up because I think the model of having a separate app that hooks up to the DCC over the network. That is certainly a model. It's not really quite the same thing that the Ephemeral system is doing, which it is actually running in, like, Maya's Python interpreter, But that is certainly, like, a way you can do things. I'd certainly be curious to take a look at it. Alright, let's take a look here. Okay, that's a little wonky looking. Like, yeah, the motion of the hand isn't quite working. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is it's kind of bobbling around there a little bit. Like, you see, it's not a very clear arc. It kind of goes up like this, and then, like, and this wasn't necessarily clear when, when it was just sort of posed out. But I think that needs to, like, I just sort of need to reconceive that arc a bit. You can sort of see the bit there, and as they whoops. Let's in between that. Pull those out a little bit more. Ah, I see the problem. So what we really want here, so we've got this thing coming up real slowly and then gripping on. And this, like, this kind of slow and fast type thing, Like, that can certainly be like a good principle sometimes. But what's happening here is it just feels super weird, because what you really want is it to, like, that slowness to be much more bunched up near the end, right? So it's sort of like, you're like, whoa, and so it should be much faster to get into the position that it's going to get into. So again, here's where, if I had time slip, I would use time slip. Time slip's not a thing yet. So instead, I'm going to use successive bias, right? Which is kind of a way of doing what time slip will be. Not even all the things that I think it will be, because you should be able to bias, in a sense, with time slip beyond the next pose and really shift things in time, while keeping the poses coherent, which is something that is, a very foreign concept to how Maya thinks of things. Although certainly people have implemented things kind of similar in, for instance, Animbot. StephDev says, thought it maybe could be applicable to you, but not confident it would really work in this case. I think referring to Cozy Blanket and its method of sort of communicating maybe across a port. I mean, I don't really know much about it, so I'm just guessing from what you're saying. And says, but if it does, it would sure as heck beat native implementations with each DCC or being so tied to Maya. So actually, the core of the ephemeral system is not really very native to a DCC. It does run, because it's currently written in Python, it does run in Maya's Python interpreter, but it could run in any Python interpreter. Like, it does not actually care. Yeah.
And beyond that, I think we actually may rewrite it in something that's non-Python and just call into it using Python's FFI bindings, partially for performance reasons. But yeah, it's the core logic, we've actually gone to quite a bit of trouble. And that's part of what the big refactoring that we have just recently been doing was like really getting things separated out, to try to separate out everything that isn't really specific to Maya out into its own code. And everything passes over sort of a message queue. And you could in theory, like, run that over TCP/IP just as easily, right? The core of the system just communicates with the Maya specific bits via little packets of data, basically. So it's in principle very similar, and part of the idea behind that is we probably would like to do this in other DCCs and possibly game engines.
We for sure would, and what that means is that it's not too dissimilar from what you're describing, right? It's just it works a little bit differently. It's not actually communicating over a port or anything, but the core of the system is basically separate from the DCC. The High Fly says, hey, Notional Pipe, have you ever taken a look at Rumba that pairs with Maya rigs? Indeed, I have, actually, and I have a lot of respect for what they're doing with Rumba. The basic idea of, like, let's basically make something that kind of works like Maya, but, faster and, with sort of a better way of developing rigs is, an excellent idea. My personal opinion, and I have to admit here that I haven't looked at what they've done very much lately, so they may well have made a lot of improvements, is that Rumba is still very much in sort of the traditional mold of how rigs and animation ought to work. Not completely, because they've done this very interesting thing, where in order to deal with handoff between, like, your character's picking something up, dealing with constraints, animating on and off, they have a much more sophisticated way of dealing with that than Maya does. So they're definitely doing some stuff that I think is really, like, interesting. But one of the things about that is it does mean that it's more complicated than what the ephemeral system does. And I really like simplicity. I think that there's something inherently simple about the approach that the ephemeral system takes that's ultimately going to make it more flexible. And then, of course, the other thing they did in Rumba, which is quite a difficult thing to do, and I respect them very much for having done this at all, is that they wrote basically something that can go in and interpret Maya rigs. And that's not easy to that's not easy to do. Like, we've looked at the ability to do that, and it is difficult to make sense of Maya rigs outside of the context of Maya. So they've done some really cool stuff, but ultimately, I don't know that I would like them to go further away from the way that Maya does things. StephDev says, having your own editor with many great UI opportunities. Well, yeah, I mean, at that point, you're basically writing your own animation tool, which I would love to do. And at that point, there's no reason, actually, to have it connect to a DCC in that way, in terms of, like, connecting how the rig evaluates to a DCC if you can evaluate it yourself. But that would be a tremendous amount of work to sort of do our own animation tool. The Highfly says, If you like simplicity, you would like Akitsu, I think. Again, yes and no. Akitsu, I do like the simplicity of their way of looking at things, right? Of their UI. But I think that the approach that they're taking is still not very simple, right? Because it inherits some of the inherent complexity of sort of traditional rigging and interpolation, right? So I do like Akitsu. That is to say, I like what they're trying to do with it. Like, I like that they're doing it, but I don't know that I feel like they're going in the right direction with it. That's just, sort of my opinion for the things that I care about. So here, what you can see going on here is that I've now bunched them up, right? So this is like more of a slow inside. I think I've bunched them up over here. Let's see what this looks like. That is significantly better, but not quite what I want it to be yet. The Highfly also says, I'm actually paired up with a software engineer from Ubisoft, making a 3D physics tool. We're trying to make our own game animation software. So if you guys would ever want to have input, would be more than welcomed. Early stages now, obviously. Sure, we'd love to talk about it. I don't really know quite what you might be envisioning in that regard, but we have many opinions about like how to set up animation software. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, certainly, absolutely feel free to do so. Let's see, what's the best.
There's contact info on the website.
There is. That's absolutely right. If you want to go to notionalpipe.com, you can certainly find out how to get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you.
Yeah.
All right, so let's take a look at this. Better, but I think I think part of the problem is I think that his hand should hit slightly earlier. Because you've got this thing where he's got like the hang time, and I like hang time. Like I like things where you're like, what? And it gets slow and then fast, But what we have here is there's something off about it, and it's a little hard for me to put my finger, describe exactly why it's off. It feels off to me, in part because I feel that aspect of things that I like and that sells this idea of like the hand doing this like big ridiculous arc, right? That doesn't really make any sense from a pure physics point of view. And the thing that would sell that is the graphical qualities of it. There's so much stuff we can get away with that we're getting away with in this very shot in animation that we only get away with because the graphical qualities and the interest of those graphical qualities overwhelms the ridiculousness of the animated physics, right? The stuff that doesn't actually make any sense at all. And here, it's not quite overwhelming it. It still feels a little weird because it's just like, it's not eye-catching enough, I guess. I do want to just go back and see the whole thing in context, though. So, because sometimes you can get too hyper-focused on stuff and sort of lose the script, Because you can see it's getting that, like, slow, fast feel that is something that I like. I think it's a combination of two things, I think, that can help this. Brian Craig says, I hate being late to these. I had a question, will we ever see a TFM3? The answer to specific... So, what Ryan Craig is referring to is the Face Machine, a product that was put out by Animating Studio. So, you will definitely not see the Face Machine 3, because the Face Machine is not a Notional Pipe product. Like, that whole sort of line of things kind of died with Animating Studio. Will we ever do facial rigging tools? Quite possibly. Like, we don't have any specific plans about that now, because we have a lot of things on our plate that we're trying to do, right? However, I certainly would not say that we would never do facial rigging tools. We absolutely might do so. It would not be the Face Machine, though.
It would hopefully be somewhat better than the Face Machine,
yes.
Actually.
I am quite certain that it would be better than the Face Machine. All right, let me just... I want to get this dealt with. Right, so there's two things here. One, I want to push... I'm going to push the contrast there even more. So make this even faster and this even slower.
So we have a couple more questions, Raph. Ryan's saying that must have been a blast from the past. I don't see a lot of good facial tools out there, which is why I asked. And yeah, that's kind of it's a tricky area because things are so specific with faces.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah, it really is. It really is like a generalized facial tool is super hard, actually. And the face machine was not 100% successful at doing so.
And then the High Fly is saying, what are some top priorities currently? Also, any animation tools planned at all, considering your complaints on animation fluidity between the softwares I was bringing up?
So, I mean, yes, in the sense that you can think of the ephemeral system itself as being an animation tool. I mean, it fundamentally really is, actually, right? Like, it's not, I mean, it's sort of sitting in Maya, using Maya's manipulators, but it's not just a rig system. It also implies this different way of animating, right? So it
Right.
kind of is like an animation system.
And although we don't have concrete plans here yet, although they're a little firmer than they used to be, I would say. But I think we would really like to move the ephemeral stuff into other systems as well.
Oh, we
I don't
absolutely
see
would.
it as being just a Maya thing. It's just we need to get the Maya implementation actually done first.
Yeah. So a couple of the other things that we want to do in the near future, and I need to like sort of put a little disclaimer on this, like, not that we have lawyers, but if we were a big enough company too, they would definitely say you have to put a disclaimer on this that says we're not making any legally, binding promises to do anything in particular. We're just discussing this. Like, this is probably what we're going to do, right? So we want to put some I wouldn't say auto rigging tools in sort of depending on how you define that term, but tools into Contour that let you sort of bash a character together real fast. Something that a little bit more resembles TSM, which is the setup machine, which is really much easier to do with Contour's tools than it is with conventional Maya tools, that's for sure. Because we do feel like there's this big market of people, like we got to the point of getting Contour out, and it was like, well, these are these great tools, and you can do stuff with them. And that was awesome, but then it's like a lot of the people who use the setup machine and a lot of the people who would really benefit from the qualities of Contour, what they really need is like, I put some widgets in a biped and I press a button, right? I mean, it's not really quite that simple, right? You're still gonna have to paint some weights, but at least it'll be a lot simpler because it's Contour, right?
Right. Not a lot of weight painting in Contour.
Right, not
less than normal.
nearly as much weight painting, right? And that's what a lot of people actually need who would really benefit from these tools. So one of the things we're working on is getting getting the that stuff into Contour. Another thing I'd like is the ability to auto generate Maya joints. Like if you've seen any of the videos we put out, and we did a stream where we did this a little bit before, there are a lot of pretty simple ways with Contour to drive regular Maya joints with it, so you can take it into a game engine and stuff. And that is that's a totally viable thing to do. But right now, if you want to do it reasonably, you need to do a little bit of scripting. Or it's just too much work to like put down each joint and manually do it, and we'd like to sort of do a little bit to automate that. And so those are some priorities for the
There are some other Contour features, some of which are done. We'll probably be putting out a new release of Contour sometime in the reasonably near future, but I won't put a date on it. So I'd say that's priority one, is just ongoing work on Contour.
Yep.
Priority two is actually eventually shipping the ephemeral system for
Yep.
Maya, which I think is a way off just because we are pretty busy with other stuff. And I would say that priority three might be starting to look at getting some of these tools into other contexts,
Yes.
into non-Maya contexts.
There are a lot of contexts where we'd ideally like to be using them. I'm already feeling like that hand's feeling a little better, by the way. Ryan Craig says, you don't have to worry about saying anything. Whatever tools makes an animation easier and better is always better, and your tools have been amazing. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. And indeed, because we are not a publicly held company, we kind of can say whatever we want, but it should be noted that, it's just a thing that's always on my mind. Companies absolutely do get in trouble when they say they're going to do something and then they end up not doing it, right? And that isn't necessarily legal trouble. It could just be like people don't like it, right?
People don't like it. I think we're pretty careful not to put dates on things.
Right.
That's something we just know is just don't ever say we're going to release this on this date, and release it and then say we released it on this date.
Yes. So I do think like there's a lot of things to comment on here, and I did kind of want to get back and finish this, but I think these things are worth addressing first. Let's see. Filippo Macchi says, "Do you know or recommend Richard Lico's animation course? Are there similarities with the ephemeral system?" I do, and there are a lot of similarities. One of the ways that I have sometimes described that in the past is that, it's a little bit much in the way that Yogurt and Dark Helmet have two different sides of the Schwartz. And now I have dated myself terribly.
Yeah, I'm not sure everybody's going to get that.
No, not everybody's going to get that. It's a Mel Brooks movie. Me and Richard kind of have Rick kind of have two sides of what interpolationless animation should be, and we're kind of gradually sort of, yes, exactly, it's Spaceballs. We're kind of gradually doing some of that stuff too, but the ephemeral system grows out of being very pose-centric, and Rick's system grows out of being very sort of like across time-centric. So he's doing all of this stuff where he bakes things down actively to be able to use animation layers on them, and then bakes that down, or be able to use physics on it and bakes that down, and he keeps baking stuff down. And that's really the kind of tools that we're actually kind of trying to get to with all of our multi-pose, across-time editing tools that you're seeing here. We approached it from these very different directions, but ultimately I think we're really going for a similar idea, which is you can edit the character's poses any way you want to. Right? That's the basic idea. For whatever you want to do, for whatever motion you're changing right now, use whatever relationships between things make sense for the thing you're doing right now. And that is, and that's the basic idea. And that basic idea is absolutely, like, they're very, very related. The High Fly says, "I haven't tried it yet, but I'm curious to see how well this pairs with Ragdoll Dynamics." So I think it would pair very, very well. And here's sort of, and actually not just Ragdoll Dynamics, any procedurally generated animation, any mocap, any animation that's generated by means other than keyframing. Because one of the things about things like that is they don't have keyframes, right? If you have anything that derives from simulation or recording of the real world or anything like that, there's no keyframes, there's no interpolation, there's just samples across time, or place, basically you've calculated the states across time. And conventionally, if you want to edit that stuff, you've got to fit it somehow into the keyframe world, either by somehow reducing that motion, or like having like maybe multiple layers of stuff on top and like stuff. And it's really, really awkward, and it's really painful. And
yeah, mocap is an area. We can't talk about the details of it, but we have been talking to some people about using ephemeral tools in their pipeline about some mocap stuff, and it's a really good fit, I think, because it's exactly that same situation.
Right, exactly. You just have states of things changing across time. You don't have, like, this special concept of keyframes. And the ability to just directly edit dense animation data, and just, as opposed to having to somehow stuff it into the keyframe model, is going to be high. Anytime keyframes really only work to the degree that they work at all, and of course, like, I'm like, well, they're actually bad, but it's not like they don't work at all, right? You can animate with them, obviously, because that's how all CG animation more or less works, right? Obviously, people can animate very well with them. It's just painful. So, but the only context in which I think they make any sense at all is where you are generating things as keyframes. Outside of that context, if you're starting from some other type of motion, keyframes are even more just like really, really, really the wrong thing. And, I think that this kind of tool provides, like, I think the ephemeral system ultimately will be something that is vastly superior to any conventional method for editing mocap, for editing stuff that you've simulated or that is in some other way recorded gameplay, like any of that stuff. Ryan Craig asks, "Do you still find Motion Trail tool as effective for tracking arcs, even though you're doing a more traditional approach?" So, no. That's not to say I think that Motion Trail tools aren't effective. I think they're much better than a graph editor. But one of the things, and I talked about this a little bit last stream, and I can sort of go into sort of how that motion works a little bit, that I think is important about arcs is to remember that arcs kind of don't necessarily mean where your controls are. So actually, this suggests to me actually something that I might want to tweak about this, come to think of it, now that I'm looking at it, which is to put these down a little bit. Because here's one of the things that you can sort of see with these onion skins, which is that your arcs do not necessarily... Actually, this is going to help. Thank you for reminding me about this, because frankly, this helps some of the issues I saw with the head movement. They're going to help you refine your motion, because what the arc actually means here is not what does where's the head's control, like that specific point in space. Look at this here. Look at the shape, the negative space described by the edge of that head movement. That doesn't correspond to any specific point. It's all about the flow of poses. And so that kind of stuff is something you can judge with with onion skinning. You really, I mean, like motion trails don't really help you judge that. Motion trails are useful. Like, I'm not saying don't use them, but there's just a lot of stuff that you can get out of onion skinning you'll just never ever be able to get out of motion trails. And so for me, I find onion skinning to just be a vastly superior method of visualizing motion, certainly than a graph editor by far, but then motion trails as well. Let's see. So let's just look at this. I mean, we're getting to the point here where I feel like, we're getting close to something that's kind of finished, right? You could always keep tweaking it and keep improving it, and it's not the best piece of animation I've ever done, right? But it is working pretty well, I think, or it's getting close to working pretty well. So let's see if we can finish it. I think I'm not going to go back and do do this bit here just for time reasons, because I think once you see me do all of this stuff, you kind of know what I would have done with this, right? It's not really going to teach you anything more. And I kind of want to stop at 6, so I'm gonna do my last little bits here, which is a lot of it's going to be about this hand and about some blinks and just fixing little things. Ryan Craig also asks, the new thing now is real-time muscle dynamics, getting easier to get your hands on too. That's true. Although I think real-time muscle dynamics, it's a bit more of a deformation thing, and also, is kind of a different thing from muscle sim, right? The kinds of stuff that people do real time. It's like kind of a different thing from like the classic, like you really sim like all the aspects of the body. Right. Although I'm sure that will eventually be real time as well.
I think it's the kind of thing that's very good for the kind of thing it's very good for.
Yes.
But not necessarily for everything.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift this hand back. Again, I'd use time slip if we had written that tool yet to do this. But I want the grip to happen like over here now, because I feel like that's part of the reason this doesn't read super well to me yet. Oh, right. It's the other ones. So let's see. So here's where having selfish nodes would really help, because then I'd be able to say, what is it relative to the box? And I kind of can't do that yet. But I want his hand to have already kind of closed on it by this point. Or, close to it. Yeah, I think that will work. Just still kind of closing on at that point. And then all right, let's see how that looks. Oh, that's much better. Like you can see him like almost pulling it towards him, I might even take it a little further. Yeah, I think I need a little more of it actually. The High Fly says, I'm talking to Marcus from Ragdoll Dynamics and possibly convincing him of updating the Ragdoll muscle system to be more fiber-like, which would be really interesting with how nice it already looks. Sure. I mean, there's so much stuff that like you kind of theoretically could do with CG that just becomes, it's just difficult because of fitting it into the paradigm we have. I mean, one of the things that me and Tagore have talked about a bit is like ML-assisted in-betweening.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's eventually going to be a pretty big thing. I think it might take a little while.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's not an easy problem, but honestly, if you see some of the crazy stuff people do with ML, like, yeah, I could see it happening.
Also, Ryan Craig asked, I think we missed this, but do you see the ephemeral system having more simulation type integration such as cloth or muscle? And I would say we don't have any real plans in that direction in the near future.
Yeah, what I would see it being good for is editing the results of simulations. So I
Right.
wouldn't say that we would
Right.
want to integrate. We wouldn't want to integrate simulation into the ephemeral system, but we would want to be able to bake simulated results to ephemeral control so that you could edit them in an ephemeral way. So I don't see us doing the simulation tools ourselves. That's not really our thing.
So the thing about it is that one of the things we're sort of headed toward with this eventually is an idea of really dense data, really dense animation data, and tools to edit that animation data by hand. But the thing about it is, this is sort of what Raf's saying, is that that data can come from anywhere.
I'm just smoothing out a little bit of a jiggle. I don't want the jiggle on the cube. Yeah, there's still something there that is not looking good. Yeah, it's like this region right in here. I'm going to in between that using just the cube. And then I'm going to bias the section back so that it's which again, this would be time slip if we had a time slip. And I might end up running a smooth on this. We'll see. Yeah, probably I will. I mean, that's definitely better in terms of like it's not all messed up, but it might need to be a little smoother. Let's see. Let's see. No, I don't think it really does. I think this works. Alright. Let's add a blink, because it really needs a blink. I don't even need to select it. Even I keep forgetting that when you store a pose, it stores everything. It's only when you apply a pose that it matters which one you selected. Which is actually, I think, a very good thing. I think maybe as his head's coming up there, he should blink. Let's see. That is, of course, something you would put in a pose library if we had an ephemeral pose library. Yeah. Yeah, I think that works. The Highfly says, for the picker, is there a hotkey to go up and down the joint hierarchy like Akitsu has so you don't have to click every time on the diagram? Yes, there is. I'm doing it right now with keys. I actually have a whole thing called Pickwalker that lets me do it, but, I don't always want to. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. Ryan Craig says, the Highfly, the ephemeral system, I would say, as you are in-betweening it yourself and then have it look better in a simulation package. Not quite sure what you mean. You might need to clarify a little bit. The Highfly says, don't you think his wrist should move slightly up at the end due to momentum? Maybe. Let's take a look. Do you mean, well, actually, his wrist is slipping slightly, so that's one thing I should fix. I'm not quite sure what area you're referring to, but quite possibly. When he swings his arm up, are you thinking it should overshoot a little bit? Maybe so. I was actually kind of thinking that might be a good idea. Let's see. So basically, like, just having a little bit of additional overshoot. Yeah, I think that does improve it. Um, let's see. Ryan Craig says, must be nice too, not worrying about what the curves are doing. It's so nice. I don't care about curves at all. Ryan Craig says, my apologies. I was just answering a question about what the best plugins would fix in-betweening my issue, which is the basis of this, right? I mean, ultimately, I do think it's just a question of what does, like, there's not gonna be a magic bullet for in-between, right? There's gonna be various approaches. And the thing that ultimately means interpolationless animation is the right thing, in my view, is that it doesn't tell you what approach you're supposed to use. It doesn't matter, right? All you're going to end up with pose data is pose data at the end. You could have some ML-based method of in-betweening. You could do it manually like I'm doing here. You could have something that uses some kind of sim. It doesn't matter, right? Ultimately, it's all going to be pose data, which means you can edit it any way you want. As opposed to something like keyframes, where you have, in a sense, construction history, right? Alright, let's take a look at this. Not going to in-between this section right at the beginning. Yeah, I mean, there are various things I could do to it to, like, improve it in small ways. Whether they're important or not, it's you know, it's sort of going to depend on the context. There's definitely, like, I could continue. I mean, you could almost continue indefinitely, right? Like, tweaking things and moving them, but you sort of take a step back from it. You look at this pose, assuming you imagine that him running in was in between, and, like, you can sort of see how this would work as a shot. So I'm going to say that is pretty much where I'm going to leave it for our streaming purposes. I'll finish it up on my own time, just so we can put it up. Yeah, no, I think I see what you mean about the... Sorry, the High Fly is saying when he brings his hand down, his hand should be slightly tilted up because the fingers would follow the momentum. Literally the only thing I could say improvement-wise. Yeah, I think I see what you're saying now, where, like, the fingers would rest on it a little differently, because right now it's very, like... I was thinking about it like he's pulling the cube inward, but in fact, you know, because of the way the hand moves, maybe they'd end up sort of, like, adjusting it a little bit like this. I'm not really going to do it right now, but I think I see what you mean. Right, and Ryan Craig says, it is not demoralizing, like going from stepped and then seeing it floaty and spline. Yeah, I mean, like, I literally don't know anyone who doesn't hate that with a passion, right? There are people who do actually like sort of the compound spline hips out kind of view of things. But that is a relatively, like, I think that you know, I'm not going to go so far as to say those people are wrong to do that, because people do have different approaches, but my feeling is that is a technique with limited utility, and also that you could still do it ephemerally if that's what you really wanted to do. And you could still do it, like, you don't actually need splines to do that technique. But for people who are thinking about things in a pose-to-pose way, which is, of course, incredibly common in animation. We have all, I mean, I won't say we all, we've generally started doing that, because the hips out approach, the like, build up your splines approach, like, failed us real hard. And for anyone who's doing that, yeah, I mean, everyone hates the bit where you spline it and it looks like crap. Nobody likes that. Let's not do it. And yes, as Brian Craig says, this kind of gets rid of that by not letting Maya in between. Exactly. Like, and again, partly it's technique, partly it's the use of the system sort of, like, being used as it was intended in terms of like how the in-betweens are generated. But, like, think about, like, yeah, I mean, I did a little noodling here and there, but I did very little noodling by comparison. And a lot of stuff that I in-between here just kind of worked okay. Because the problem is that when you take stuff like this, stuff that works as a, works as poses, and you spline it, the splining is adding more information, right? It's adding, in a sense, garbage information that's been derived from your poses that you probably don't actually want, which is why some animators who do interpolated animation will actually just leave everything linear, which is, you know, I think it's sometimes better than spline. Of course, I don't want linear either, right? I just want poses. But there's a very good reason why people do that, right? It's not just spline overshoot, although that's a problem. Using like auto tangents can sort of help with that a bit, but it is like spline uh it's the splines interpreting your motion in a way that doesn't necessarily have anything in particular to do with what you were creating, and in a way that is entirely isolated from the motion of any other control. The interpolation happens in a space determined by other controls, because you've got a hierarchy or more complex stuff going on with your rig, but the interpolation itself doesn't even know that. All it sees is, here are some values. Here are some scalar values, they're just numbers. And I'm going to interpolate those with a spline, and that's all it knows. It doesn't know anything other than, I have some keyframes and they're just numbers. And they're single individual numbers. They're not even like, they don't describe anything other than a single value. And it's not a good idea. It is an idea that seemed like, that was like when people were trying to figure out how the hell to do animation on a computer, it's understandable that this is the idea that they would come to, but that was in the 1980s, and we are not in the 1980s anymore. Like, we should have a better option. The Highfly says, something I think would really help contour rig and adoption more possibly is having a free rigs tab that has rigs that you guys are willing to give free and the community gives out. We would love to do more of that, actually. I mean, we've got the superhero dude, and he's a rig that you can just use if you want to. We'd love to make more of them. We just haven't.
I think he might be suggesting that we should allow people to submit them, and that's actually probably a pretty good idea.
That's a good idea. We should allow people to submit them, actually.
That's a good idea. I think we'll take that under advisement. I think you're right. That does sound like a good thing to do.
So anyway, I mean, I kind of feel like our adventure animating this rabbit has been concluded now. I'll finish up the last little bits myself.
I will say we do have to be a little bit careful about that, because it is actually possible to spread malicious software through rigs.
Ooh, it actually is.
Right.
This is a good point. We would have to make sure that we checked for that. Although there's a limited number of ways you can do it with a rig, so it would be possible to check.
They'd have to be manually hand checked, though. We couldn't just have something where it's like, you can upload a rig, right?
Yeah. Because... No, this has happened. Like, I don't know if you guys have heard about the Highfly was saying, "Whoa, what?" And I'm responding by saying, like, "Yeah, no, I mean, this is a thing." And
when you load a rig, it can execute arbitrary Python code on your computer with the permissions that Maya has.
That's right.
As it's running. So, yeah.
Because Maya has a thing called a script node, which is a node in your scene that can run code when you load your scene, which is quite useful in many pipelines for doing things when you load your scene. Like, there's plenty of reasons why you would do that. One of the things you can do with it is make a virus. And this actually apparently came as a huge surprise to Autodesk, a couple of years ago when this happened for the first time. And they scrambled to, get, a little plugin out that could check for it. It was, I don't think that this had any particularly horrific consequences. People became aware of it before the date that it would have kicked in happened. Because you know what it did was, on that date, it would try to divide by 0. So you'd open Maya to crash instantly.
Right.
But everybody, the thing was, you could scrub that stuff without even having to open the file if it was a Maya ASCII file, and even if it wasn't, you could suppress script nodes on load. So it's not like you couldn't get out of it. But a Python is allowed to do stuff to your file system. So
but Python's allowed to do. Yeah, I mean, you can do essentially anything that the executable has permission to do, including on the average Windows system, essentially completely root the machine.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something we'd have to be a little careful about. But I think it's a good idea. We just would have to actually manually look at submissions.
In many ways, it's surprising that it didn't do more damage than it did, because it was really only written to do that thing where it would lock up your Maya and nothing worse. It absolutely could have deleted stuff out of your file system, but it didn't. And it also was really, really obvious that it was happening because they'd written I actually think it might have been written in Mel, if I recall correctly, and they obfuscated it, but your average Mel script doesn't look like a whole bunch of gobbledygook. So it was pretty obvious that something weird was going on, and then they had a couple of variable names that you could actually see, and I apologize to anyone with delicate sensibilities. I don't swear very much on stream, but this variable was called "fuck all you," and it was that was not a thing
Yeah.
that you saw in any official thing from Autodesk or probably most studios, although who knows. But yeah,
Yeah. Do be a bit careful about that, by the way. Google's algorithms can pick that up. And so obviously we're not going to get demonetized because we don't monetize our stream,
Right.
but still they can lower things in the rankings. So
right.
I think
Well, although
you probably should avoid swearing.
should avoid swearing. I don't know. I'm sort of like, given internet culture, I'm kind of surprised people don't just do it constantly. But
Google will penalize you.
Google will
for it.
penalize you
At
for
least
it.
that's my understanding. YouTube. So
YouTube, yeah.
probably not once, right? Because everybody occasionally
Right.
has a bad day. But
I mean, I don't need a particularly bad day to swear, but I don't generally do it in a professional context, right?
Right.
So the, I mean, basically, yeah, that was a thing, and everyone kind of had to scramble about it for a bit. Anyway, it is now 6:00. I need to get going, but I think that our ephemeral, stuff here has concluded, and next time we're going to be on to something else. Maybe we'll take a look at componentized rigging. Maybe we'll deal with writing a better script. We'll talk a little bit about some Python stuff probably involving that thing of mirroring transform space blend shapes, which I would really like a better script to do than the one that I have. Anyway, yeah. And I will see you all you guys next week. I will note that there are going to be 2 weeks coming up where I will not be able to stream, and they're both for SIGGRAPH related reasons. I'll be at SIGGRAPH, and then there's actually going to be a whole bunch of stuff happening remotely the week before, and so I won't be able to stream on those 2 weeks. But I believe that is certainly not going to be next week, so we will definitely be there. Let me just check the calendar. Yeah, next week we'll stream. The week after that is going to be the start of our 2-week break.
right, so we'll be back on the 16th of August.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great to see you guys.
All
like
right.
and subscribe. It's very important.
Yep.
And I hope
Speaking
to
of
see
YouTube
you here
algorithms.
next week. That's right.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.